Hey guys, tonight you're not settling into the warm, comforting glow of the little house on the prairie that generations of Americans grew up cherishing, where Pa's fiddle fills the cabin with music, and Ma's bread rises golden in the oven, and three little girls in calico dresses live out their pioneer childhood in a world of simple hardships and simpler triumphs. You're opening a book published in 1935 by Harper and Brothers, a children's novel written by a 68-year-old woman named Laura Ingalls Wilder, who desperately needed money during the Great Depression, and you are reading a sentence on page 3 that will teach millions of American children that Native Americans are not human beings. The sentence reads, "There were no people, only Indians lived there." You need to sit with those words for a moment. You need to understand what they're saying. Not what Laura Ingalls Wilder claimed they meant when a furious reader finally complained 17 years later. Not what modern defenders argue she intended. What the words actually say in plain English to a child reading them for the first time. There were no people, only Indians lived there. The sentence structure is deliberate. The logic is explicit. The division is absolute. People exist in one category, Indians exist in another category, and those two categories do not overlap. Indians are not people. This is not ambiguous. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a declarative statement that places indigenous peoples outside the boundaries of humanity, that erases their personhood with the casual efficiency of a single sentence, that teaches children to see Native Americans as something other than human, something less than human, something that does not count when you are tallying up whether people live in a place or not. You are holding this book in your hands, Little House on the Prairie, the third volume in a series that will sell more than 60 million copies worldwide, that will be translated into 40 languages, that will be taught in elementary schools across America for generations, that will shape how countless children understand westward expansion and frontier history, and the relationship between white settlers and indigenous peoples. And this sentence, this single sentence that denies the humanity of Native Americans, is on page 3. It is not buried deep in the text. It is not a minor detail that casual readers might miss. It is the foundational premise of the entire book, the ideological framework that supports everything that follows, the thesis statement that justifies the Ingalls family's presence on Osage land, by declaring that no people lived there before they arrived. You need to know that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote this sentence in the early 1930s, sitting at her desk at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, more than 60 years after the event she was describing. She was not a child recording her innocent perceptions. She was an elderly woman making conscious choices about how to tell a story, what language to use, what messages to send to young readers. She wrote that sentence with full adult awareness. She chose those words. She structured that sentence to create exactly the meaning it conveys. And you need to know that when her daughter Rose Wilder Lane read the manuscript, when the editors at Harper and Brothers reviewed it for publication, when the book went through multiple rounds of editing and revision before it appeared in bookstores in 1935, nobody questioned that sentence. Nobody suggested changing it. Nobody pointed out that it explicitly denies the humanity of indigenous peoples. The sentence survived every level of editorial review because everyone involved in producing the book either agreed with its premise or did not consider it problematic enough to warrant revision. The book was published. It became a bestseller. It was read by millions of children, and for 17 years that sentence stood unchallenged in print, teaching generation after generation of young Americans that Indians were not people, that their presence on the land did not count, that white settlers could claim territory was empty even when indigenous nations lived there, because indigenous peoples did not qualify as people in the first place. 17 years. Think about that. 17 years of children reading that sentence, absorbing that lesson, internalizing that hierarchy. 17 years before anyone objected loudly enough that the publisher paid attention. 17 years before Laura Ingalls Wilder was forced to confront what she had written and offer an explanation. And when that moment finally came, when a reader wrote an angry letter to Ursula Nordstrom at Harper & Row in 1952, when Nordstrom contacted Wilder and pointed out the problem with the sentence, Laura Ingalls Wilder's response was not an apology. It It was not a recognition that the sentence expressed a genocidal ideology. It was not an acknowledgement that her words had caused harm to Indigenous readers or had perpetuated racism against Native Americans. Her response was, "It was a stupid blunder of mine. Of course, Indians are people, and I did not intend to imply they were not. A stupid blunder." As if the sentence had been a typo, an accidental grammatical error, a slip of the pen rather than a deliberate expression of the worldview that had shaped her entire childhood, that had justified her family's illegal occupation of Osage territory, that had allowed white settlers to convince themselves that they were pioneering empty land rather than stealing inhabited territory from sovereign nations who had lived there for generations. You're sitting in a quiet room, holding this book, and you are beginning to understand that the story you thought you knew about Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House books is not the whole story. You're beginning to see that beneath the comforting narrative of pioneer family life, beneath the descriptions of Pa's fiddle and Ma's cooking and the girls' adventures on the prairie, there is another story, a darker story, a story about racism and erasure and the systematic dehumanization of Indigenous peoples. A story about how beloved American literature taught children to accept genocide as natural, inevitable, even wholesome. And you're beginning to realize that this single sentence is just the beginning. That what Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about Native Americans goes far deeper than one careless phrase. That the published books contain depictions that are shocking even by the standards of 1930s children's literature. And that her original manuscripts, the drafts that were edited before publication, contained language so extreme that even Depression-era publishers could not print it. The sentence was eventually changed. In 1953, Harper and Row issued new editions with a revised version that read, "There were no settlers, only Indians lived there." But you need to understand what this revision does and does not do. It removes the explicit statement that Indians are not people, but it still implies that Indians are not settlers, not legitimate inhabitants, not rightful occupants of the land. It still creates a hierarchy where white people are settlers, a term that suggests intention and purpose and right, while Indians are simply there, a term that suggests accident, transience, lack of claim. The revision softens the racism, it does not eliminate it. And the revision came 17 years too late for the millions of children who had already read the original sentence. 17 years too late for the Native American children who had been forced to read a book that declared their ancestors were not people. 17 years too late to undo the damage that the sentence had caused, the ideology it had spread, the worldview it had reinforced. You close the book, you set it down. And you understand that what you have just read is not simply an unfortunate phrase from a different era. It is evidence of something larger, something more systematic, something that goes to the heart of how America has remembered its own history, how it has justified its expansion, how it has taught children to accept the dispossession of Indigenous peoples as a natural and necessary part of the nation's development. The line that said, "Indians weren't people," is your entry point into this story. But the full story is much longer, much more complicated, and much more disturbing than a single sentence can convey. And you're about to learn exactly what Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote, what she deleted, what she defended, and why it matters that we finally confront the racism that shaped one of America's most beloved children's book series. You're a 5-year-old child in 1940 sitting in your elementary school classroom somewhere in Wisconsin or Iowa or Minnesota, one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone, and the library has 3 shelves of children's books, and your teacher, Miss Anderson, has just announced that she's going to read aloud from a new book called Little House on the Prairie. You're excited, you love story time, you love the way Miss Anderson's voice changes when she reads different characters, the way she makes the stories come alive, the way the whole classroom gets quiet and everyone leans forward to listen. This book is about a family who lived on the prairie a long time ago, Miss Anderson explains. A family with 3 daughters just like some of you. A family who built a house and planted crops and survived all sorts of adventures in a time when America was still being settled. She begins to read. A long time ago, when all the grandfathers and grandmothers of today were little boys and little girls or very small babies, or perhaps not even born, Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura and baby Carrie left their little house in the big woods of Wisconsin. Her voice is warm and inviting. You picture the family in their covered wagon heading west toward adventure. You imagine yourself as Laura, the middle daughter, brave and curious and always asking questions. And then Miss Anderson reads the sentence. There were no people, only Indians lived there. You do not question it. You are 5 years old. You trust your teacher. You trust books. You absorb the sentence the way children absorb everything they are taught at this age, uncritically, completely, as simple fact. There were no people where the Ingalls family was going. Only Indians lived there. And since there were no people, only Indians, the natural conclusion your 5-year-old brain draws is that Indians are not people. You do not understand that this is racist. You do not have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to recognize that you have just been taught to dehumanize an entire group of human beings. You only understand that the book has divided the world into 2 categories, people and Indians, and that these categories are separate and distinct and unequal. Miss Anderson continues reading. She does not pause at the sentence. She does not offer any clarification or context. She does not say, now. Children, of course the author doesn't really mean that Indians aren't people. She just means there were no white settlers yet. She reads straight through, because she is reading exactly what is printed on the page, and what is printed on the page is a sentence that explicitly denies Indigenous people's humanity. The story continues. You hear about the long journey across the prairie, about building the log cabin, about the well past digs and the fireplace he constructs. You hear about Indians who come to visit the cabin, and the way Miss Anderson reads these passages, her voice drops lower, becomes more tense, more frightening. The Indians are described as bold and fierce and terrible, their eyes black and still and glittering. Ma is afraid of them. The neighbours talk about Indian uprisings. There is a constant sense of threat, of danger lurking just outside the cabin walls, and you absorb this too. You learn that Indians are scary, that they are dangerous, that white families like the Ingallses have good reason to fear them. You do not learn that the Ingalls family is living on land that belongs to the Osage Nation, that they are illegal squatters occupying territory guaranteed to Indigenous peoples by federal treaty, that the Indians who visit their cabin are Osage people asserting their presence on their own land. You do not learn any of this because the book does not tell you, and Miss Anderson does not know it herself, or if she knows, she does not think it is relevant to the story. You are learning history through fiction, and the history you are learning is false. Not false in its details, necessarily. Laura Ingalls Wilder did live on the Kansas prairie, did experience the events she describes, did witness Osage people passing near her family's cabin, but false in its framing, in its perspective, in its moral logic. False because it presents the story from the point of view of the colonizers and never acknowledges that colonization is what is happening. False because it treats Indigenous peoples as obstacles to progress rather than as human beings whose land is being stolen. False because it makes you sympathize with the white family's fears while never asking you to consider what the Osage people felt, watching their territory being invaded by thousands of white squatters who had no legal right to be there. This is how racism is taught, not through explicit lessons in hatred, not through teachers standing at the front of the classroom saying, "Children, today we're going to learn why some people are inferior to others." Racism is taught through stories that present racist assumptions as natural, obvious, unquestionable, through books that divide humanity into people and others, through narratives that make you identify with the colonizers and fear the colonized, through sentences that slip past your critical faculties because you are 5 years old and you do not yet have critical faculties, and by the time you develop them, the lessons you learned at 5 are so deeply embedded that you do not even recognize them as lessons. You think they are just facts, just the way things are, just the truth about history. You grow up reading the rest of the Little House series. You read about the long winter in Dakota Territory, about Laura's courtship with Almanzo, about the hard work and simple pleasures of pioneer life. You love these books. They become part of your childhood, part of how you understand American history, part of the stories you tell yourself about who you are and where you come from. And woven through all of these beloved stories is the thread of indigenous erasure, the constant implication that the land was empty before white settlers arrived, that Native Americans were peripheral figures in their own dispossession, that westward expansion was an adventure rather than a conquest. You do not question this. Why would you? The books are in the school library. Your teacher reads them aloud. Your parents give them to you for Christmas. Everyone agrees that Laura Ingalls Wilder is a wonderful author who wrote beautiful stories about pioneer life. And if the stories contain racism, if they teach you to see indigenous peoples as less than human, well, that is just how people thought back then. That is just the historical reality. That is just the way things were. Except that is not quite true. Because even in Laura Ingalls Wilder's own time, even in the 1870s when she was a child living on Osage land, there were people who recognised that what was happening to indigenous nations was wrong. There were voices arguing that treaty rights should be honoured, that Native Americans were human beings who deserved justice, that westward expansion was built on theft and violence. Those voices existed. But Laura Ingalls Wilder did not include them in her books. She chose to tell a different story, a story that centred white settlers and marginalised indigenous peoples, a story that made colonization seem natural and inevitable and even wholesome. And by the time you're an adult, by the time you have children of your own, and perhaps give them the Little House books to read because you loved them when you were young, the cycle continues. Another generation absorbs the same lessons. Another generation learns to see American history through the lens of pioneer mythology. Another generation fails to recognize that the empty land was never empty, that the fierce Indians were people defending their homes, that the little house on the prairie was built on stolen ground. This is the power of children's literature. It shapes how we see the world before we are old enough to question what we're being shown. It teaches us whose perspectives matter and whose can be ignored. It tells us which stories are worth telling and which should be forgotten. And when those stories contain racism, when they dehumanize entire groups of people, the damage they cause lasts for generations. You're sitting in a university library in 2014, and you've just opened a book that was not supposed to exist. The book is called Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, and it is Laura Ingalls Wilder's original manuscript, the one she wrote in 1930 before she revised it into the children's novels that made her famous. This manuscript was rejected by every publisher she sent it to. It sat in archives for decades, and now, for the first time, you can read what Laura actually wrote before her daughter Rose and the editors at Harper & Brothers convinced her to change it. You turn to the section about Kansas, about the time the Ingalls family lived on Osage land. You know the published version by heart. You've read Little House on the Prairie multiple times. You know the story of the log cabin, the wolf pack, the Indians who visit, the eventual departure when the government threatens to remove white squatters. But now, you're going to see what Laura wrote before it was edited for children, before it was softened and sanitized and made suitable for publication. The first thing you notice is that the published version aged Laura up. In the books, she's depicted as perhaps 7 or 8 years old during the Kansas period, old enough to have clear memories and meaningful conversations. In reality, in the original manuscript, Laura acknowledges that she was only 2 to 4 years old when the family lived in Kansas. She could not possibly remember most of the events she describes in such detail. She is reconstructing her childhood from family stories, from things her parents told her years later, from her own imagination filling in gaps in her memory. This matters, because it means that when Laura writes about Indians in Little House on the Prairie, she is not recording a child's innocent perceptions. She is an adult woman in her 60s making conscious choices about how to depict indigenous peoples, what language to use, what incidents to include, what message to send. Every racist sentence in that book reflects Laura's adult worldview in the 1930s, not her childish misunderstandings in the 1870s. You continue reading. You reach the passages about Osage people visiting the cabin, and you see that the published version actually softened what Laura originally wrote. In Pioneer Girl, the descriptions are harsher. Laura writes about Osage men entering the cabin and taking cornbread without asking, and she frames this as theft, as frightening aggression, without ever acknowledging that these men had every right to the food, because the Ingalls family was squatting on Osage land, eating crops grown on Osage territory, living in a cabin built on ground that did not belong to them. You see Laura's description of Osage physical appearance, and even in the published version that went through editorial review, the language is dehumanizing. The Osage men are described with bold and fierce and terrible faces. Their eyes are black and still and glittering. They move silently, speak in guttural tones, smell of skunk grease. Every detail is chosen to make them seem alien, threatening, less than fully human. And in the original manuscript, before editing, these descriptions were even more extreme. You read the passage where Laura describes her mother Caroline's reaction to Osage visitors, and you see the line that appears in the published book, the line that has become infamous among scholars who study racism in children's literature. A neighbour, Mrs. Scott, says, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." In the published version, Parr contradicts this statement, defending Indians as people who have been wronged by the government. But you notice that Parr's defence is weak, paternalistic, more concerned with abstract justice than with actual indigenous peoples. And you notice that nowhere in the book does Laura, as author, explicitly reject Mrs. Scott's genocidal statement. She puts it in a neighbour's mouth rather than her mother's, but she does not condemn it. She simply reports it as one of the views that existed on the frontier, as if saying that an entire group of people should be exterminated is just an opinion, a perspective, something that reasonable people might have believed at the time. And then you find the passage that was cut entirely from the published version. In the original manuscript, Laura describes an incident where white settlers talk about the possibility of an Indian uprising, where they discuss what they would do if Indians attacked, where they fantasize about violence, about defending their land against the people who actually owned it. The language is explicit, the hatred is undisguised, and the editors at Harper & Brothers looked at this passage and decided it was too much, too revealing of the violence that underpinned white settlement, too likely to make readers uncomfortable with the Ingalls family's presence on Osage land. So they cut it. They removed the most explicit expressions of racism and violence, and in doing so they created a sanitized version of Laura's story that was palatable to Depression-era readers looking for comforting narratives about pioneer family life. They made the Ingalls family seem more innocent, more sympathetic, more worthy of readers' identification and admiration. They erased the evidence that white settlers were willing to kill indigenous peoples to secure land they had no right to claim. But the erasure was incomplete, because even after editing, even after softening and sanitizing, the published Little House books still contain racism, still deny indigenous humanity, still frame westward expansion from the colonizer's perspective without ever acknowledging what colonization meant for the people whose land was being taken. The editors removed the worst passages, but they left the underlying ideology intact. They cut the tree of racism back, but they did not pull it up by the roots. You close the Pioneer Girl manuscript, you sit back in your library chair, and you understand that you have just seen proof of something important. Laura Ingalls. Wilder's racism was not accidental. It was not the product of innocent ignorance or childish misunderstanding. It was deliberate, conscious, central to how she understood and told her own story. And when publishers tried to make her books less racist, they succeeded only in making the racism less obvious, less explicit, more easily denied by readers who wanted to believe that the Little House series was just a wholesome tale of family life on the frontier. The truth is more complicated. The truth is that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote books that taught generations of American children to see indigenous peoples as obstacles rather than human beings, as problems to be solved rather than nations with rights and sovereignty. And even when editors removed the most offensive passages, even when they softened the most extreme language, they could not remove the fundamental worldview that shaped every page. The worldview that said white settlers had the right to take indigenous land, that indigenous peoples' claims to their own territory were less important than white families' desires for new opportunities, that colonization was progress, expansion was destiny, and anyone who stood in the way of white settlement was an enemy to be feared and ultimately removed. This worldview saturates the Little House books. It is in the structure of the narrative, which centres white pioneers and marginalises indigenous peoples. It is in the language Laura chooses, which describes white families in loving detail, while reducing Native Americans to threatening silhouettes. It is in the incidents she includes, and the incidents she omits, in the questions she asks and the questions she never thinks to pose. And it is in that one sentence on page 3 of Little House on the Prairie, the sentence that declares there were no people, only Indians, the sentence that draws a line between humanity and indigenous peoples and places Native Americans on the wrong side of that line. You are beginning to understand why this matters, why a single sentence in a children's book published in 1935 deserves hours of analysis and critique, because that sentence has been read by millions of children, because it has shaped how generations of Americans understand their own history, because it has taught people to accept the dispossession of indigenous nations as natural, inevitable, even wholesome. And because until we confront the racism in beloved texts like the Little House books, until we acknowledge what Laura Ingalls Wilder actually wrote, and what her editors tried to hide, we cannot fully understand how American culture has perpetuated indigenous erasure and made genocide seem like manifest destiny. The story continues from here, but you need to understand what you have learned in this first chapter before you can go deeper. You need to sit with the knowledge that a book you may have loved, a book that millions of people still love, contains a sentence that denies the humanity of Native Americans. You need to recognize that this sentence was not an accident, not a blunder, not an innocent mistake. It was a deliberate expression of racist ideology. And the fact that it took 17 years for anyone to complain, the fact that the revision was superficial and inadequate, the fact that the books continue to be read and loved and defended despite their racism, all of this tells you something crucial about America's relationship with its own history. You are standing on the Osage Diminished Reserve in southeastern Kansas in August of 1869, and you need to understand something before we go any further. This land is not empty. This land is not available. This land is not yours for the taking, no matter what the white man standing next to you with his surveying equipment is telling you, no matter what rumours you heard back in Wisconsin about Kansas territory opening for homesteading, no matter what you want to believe about your right to claim 160 acres and build a future for your family. This land belongs to the Osage Nation. Not belonged, past tense, as if their ownership is a historical artifact that no longer matters, belongs, present tense right now, in this moment when you're standing here deciding whether to build a cabin or move on. The Osage people hold legal title to this territory through treaties signed with the United States government. The Treaty of Canville, signed in 1865, specifically guaranteed this reserve to the Osage Nation in perpetuity. That means forever. That means the land is theirs and will remain theirs, and no white settler has any legal right to occupy it without Osage permission. But you are Charles Ingalls, and you're 33 years old, and you've been farming in Wisconsin for 12 years, and you have almost nothing to show for it. You have a wife and 3 daughters to feed. You have debts piling up. You have heard stories about Kansas, about rich soil and abundant game, and opportunities for men willing to work hard. And you have heard, from sources you trust or want to trust or desperately need to trust, that the government is about to open the Kansas Indian Territory for homesteading, that settlers who get there first will have their choice of the best land, that this is your chance to claim the future you have been chasing since you married Caroline. So you came here. You loaded your family into a covered wagon, and you drove south and west across Iowa and into Kansas, and you crossed into Indian Territory even though the boundaries were clearly marked, even though you passed signs and landmarks that indicated you were entering restricted land. Even though federal law explicitly prohibited white settlement in this area without government authorization. You crossed those boundaries because you chose to believe that the law was about to change, that your presence here would soon be legal, that you were not stealing land but simply arriving early to claim what would rightfully be yours once the territory opened. This is the lie that Charles Ingalls told himself, This is the lie that hundreds of other white squatters told themselves as they flooded onto the Osage Diminished Reserve in 1869 and 1870. This is the lie that made it possible for ordinary people who thought of themselves as honest and hard-working and faithful Christians, to commit what was essentially theft on a massive scale. They convinced themselves that the land was about to be available, that their illegal occupation was just a temporary technical violation that would be resolved in their favour, that the Osage people would be moved somewhere else soon, and therefore it did not really matter if white families started building cabins and ploughing fields before the official authorization came through. But you need to see this moment from the other side. You need to understand what the Osage people saw when they returned from their winter hunts in the spring of 1870 and found their lands occupied by white families who had no permission to be there. You are Osage, and you are riding across your nation's territory in April of 1870, and you are coming home after months of hunting buffalo on the plains to the west. And you are expecting to return to the villages where your people have lived for generations, to the cornfields your women planted before the winter hunts, to the territory that was guaranteed to you by federal treaty as compensation for the millions of acres you were forced to cede in previous decades. And instead you find white people everywhere. White families living in cabins they built on your land. White men ploughing fields that belong to your nation. White women hanging laundry on lines strung between trees your ancestors planted. White children playing in creeks where Osage children should be swimming. Hundreds of white families, maybe 500 or more, occupying your territory as if they own it, as if your treaties mean nothing, as if your presence here for centuries gives you no rights that white settlers are bound to respect. You ride to the nearest white cabin. You do not attack. You do not threaten. You simply present yourself at the door and ask, in whatever combination of Osage and English and hand gestures you can manage, what these people think they're doing on Osage land. And the white man who answers the door, who might be Charles Ingalls or any of the other squatters who have invaded your territory, tells you that he has received word from Washington that the land is being opened for settlement, that he has every right to be here, that you will be moving to Indian Territory in Oklahoma soon, and he is simply claiming what will be his once the official paperwork goes through. He is lying, or he is repeating lies that other white men told him. But either way, the effect is the same. He is occupying your land. He is building permanent structures on territory that belongs to your nation. He is stealing resources, timber and water and game that your people need to survive. And when you object, when you assert your rights under federal treaty, he dismisses your claims as irrelevant, as obstacles to progress, as problems that the government will soon solve by removing you to some other location where you will not interfere with white settlement. This is what colonization looks like up close, not an abstract historical process, not a grand narrative of westward expansion and manifest destiny, but specific acts of theft committed by specific individuals who convinced themselves that what they were doing was acceptable, legal, even admirable. Charles Ingalls was a colonizer. The families who squatted alongside him on the Osage Diminished Reserve were colonizers, and the fact that they saw themselves as pioneers, as hard-working settlers pursuing legitimate opportunities, does not change what they actually were. Illegal occupants of indigenous land, participants in a system of dispossession that would ultimately force the Osage Nation to sell their Kansas territory and relocate to Oklahoma at a fraction of the land's actual value. Laura Ingalls Wilder knew this. As an adult writing in the 1930s, she had access to the historical record. She knew that her family had been illegal squatters. She knew that the Osage people had held legal title to the land. She knew that federal troops eventually came to remove white settlers because their presence violated federal law and treaty obligations. She knew all of this, and she chose to tell the story differently. She chose to frame her family's occupation of Osage land as innocent pioneering rather than illegal squatting. She chose to present the Osage people as threatening presences rather than landowners defending their property. She chose to centre her family's fears and hopes and dreams while marginalising the Osage perspective entirely. And this choice matters, because the story Laura told in Little House on the Prairie has shaped how millions of Americans understand westward expansion. The story teaches readers to sympathise with white settlers and to see indigenous peoples as obstacles. The story makes colonization seem natural, inevitable, even wholesome. The story erases the violence and theft that made white settlement possible, but you are learning the real story now. You are seeing what actually happened on the Osage Diminished Reserve in 1869 and 1870, and you are beginning to understand the gap between the mythology Laura Ingalls Wilder created and the historical reality she chose to obscure. You are reading a federal document dated November 1st, 1869, a report written by G.C. Snow, the US Indian agent assigned to the Osage Nation, and his words are blunt, angry, frustrated. He is writing to his superiors in Washington, and he is describing a crisis that the federal government created and now refuses to solve. His report documents what is happening on the Osage Diminished Reserve, and every sentence is evidence of the theft that the Ingalls family participated in. Snow writes, "The Osage have been most shamefully imposed upon by the whites. Squatters have taken possession of their cornfields and forbidden them cutting firewood on their claims." You need to pause on that sentence. The Osage people returned to their own territory and found that white squatters had claimed their agricultural fields, the land where Osage women had planted corn before leaving for the winter hunts, and these squatters were now forbidding the Osage from gathering firewood, essential fuel for cooking and heating, on land that legally belonged to the Osage Nation. This is not settlement. This is theft. This is white families stealing resources from indigenous peoples and then using violence or threats of violence to prevent the rightful owners from accessing their own property. Snow continues, "The Osage are losing horses at the rate of 100 per month to white thieves. 100 horses per month. Think about what that means. Horses were essential to Osage survival, necessary for hunting, for transportation, for trade. And white settlers were stealing them at such a rate that the Osage were losing their economic foundation, their ability to maintain their way of life, their capacity to compete in the changing economy of the post-Civil War West. The theft was systematic, organized, devastating. And Agent Snow's reports make clear that the squatters were the thieves, that white families like the Ingalls were living alongside and benefiting from a system of organized theft that was destroying the Osage economy. But the most damning part of Snow's report is what he says about violence. He documents murders. He describes a young Osage man who was most brutally and shockingly murdered while alone and helpless, literally beaten to death by white settlers. He reports attacks on Osage camps. He details incidents where squatters used guns to drive Osage families away from land the Osage legally owned. And he makes clear that the federal government, despite its treaty obligations to protect the Osage Nation, was doing nothing to stop the violence, nothing to remove the illegal squatters, nothing to enforce the law that guaranteed Osage ownership of the reserve. This is the world Laura Ingalls Wilder lived in when she was a toddler in Kansas. This is the reality that surrounded her family's cabin on Plum Creek. The Ingalls family was part of a community of white squatters who were systematically stealing from and threatening the Osage people, and while there is no evidence that Charles Ingalls personally stole horses or participated in violence against the Osage, his presence on Osage land contributed to the crisis. Every white family that squatted on the reserve made the Osage position more precarious, made it more likely that the federal government would eventually cave to white pressure and force the Osage to sell their land, made the ultimate dispossession more inevitable. You're sitting in a government office in Washington, D.C., in the spring of 1870, and you're reading reports from Kansas, and you're making calculations about political pressure and economic interests and treaty obligations. And you're coming to the conclusion that the United States government is going to break its promises to the Osage Nation. Again, the numbers are stark. 500 white families are illegally occupying the Osage Diminished Reserve. They are voters. They have political influence. They represent the white settlers that both political parties are courting as the nation expands westward. They are writing letters to their congressmen, demanding that the government open the Kansas Indian Territory for legal homesteading. They are organizing, lobbying, creating pressure that makes it politically costly to enforce the law and remove them from Osage land. On the other side of the equation are the Osage people, approximately 3,000 to 5,000 individuals who hold legal title to the land through federal treaty. But they are not voters, they are not citizens, they have no representation in Congress, their political influence is minimal, and the precedent is clear. When indigenous treaty rights conflict with white settlers' desires, the United States government sides with the settlers, every time, without exception, so the decision is made, not officially, not through any dramatic announcement, but through quiet negotiations and bureaucratic maneuvering. The government will pressure the Osage Nation to sign a new treaty selling their Kansas land and relocating to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. The sale will be framed as voluntary, as a mutually beneficial agreement. But everyone involved knows the truth. The Osage are being forced to sell because the federal government cannot or will not enforce the law protecting their territory. Because white squatters have created facts on the ground that make Osage ownership untenable. Because the United States has decided that white settlement is more important than treaty obligations or indigenous rights. The Treaty of Drum Creek is signed in June of 1870. The Osage agree to sell their Kansas reserve for $1,200,000, approximately $1.25 per acre, for land that is worth far more. They agree to relocate to Oklahoma, where they will use the proceeds to purchase land from the Cherokee Nation, and they agree to leave Kansas within a year. The white squatters celebrate. Their illegal occupation has been rewarded. The land they stole is now legally theirs, or will be once they file their homestead claims. They convinced themselves that they were innocent pioneers pursuing legitimate opportunities, and now the government has validated that self-image by making their theft legal after the fact. Charles Ingalls can tell himself that he did nothing wrong, that he simply arrived early to claim land that was about to be opened anyway, that the Osage were going to be moved eventually so his presence did not really harm anyone. But you need to see what this meant for the Osage Nation. You need to understand what it feels like to be forced from your homeland, to have your legal rights violated by illegal squatters, to watch the government that promised to protect you instead reward the people who stole from you. You are Osage, and you are packing your belongings in preparation for the move to Oklahoma, and you are looking at the land your ancestors lived on for generations, the burial grounds where your relatives are resting, the cornfields your grandmothers planted, the creeks where you learned to fish as a child, and you're being forced to leave all of this because white families wanted your land, and the United States government decided that white desires were more important than Osage rights. You have lost 90% of your nation's original territory through a series of forced treaties. You have watched your population decline by 95% due to disease and starvation and violence that accompanied colonization. You have tried to adapt, to negotiate, to find ways to survive in a world that is hostile to your existence. And now you are being forced to move again, to start over in Oklahoma with whatever you can carry, to rebuild on land you will have to purchase from another indigenous nation that was also displaced by white expansion. This is genocide. Not the Hollywood version with dramatic massacres and cavalry charges, but the legal definition, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. The systematic destruction of your nation through forced removal, theft of land and resources, breaking of treaty obligations and creation of conditions designed to make indigenous survival impossible. This is what the Ingalls family participated in. This is what Laura Ingalls Wilder chose not to write about when she published Little House on the Prairie. You're Laura Ingalls Wilder, and you're 68 years old, and you're sitting at your desk at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri in 1935, and you're making a choice. You've just written a book about your family's time in Kansas, a book that your daughter Rose has helped you revise and polish, a book that Harper and Brothers is about to publish as Little House on the Prairie. And you are looking at the manuscript, and you are deciding what to include and what to leave out, whose perspective to centre and whose to marginalise, which truths to tell and which to obscure. You know that your family was living on Osage land. You know this because you have lived your entire life with the memory of that time, because your parents talked about it, because the family eventually had to leave when federal troops came to remove the squatters. You know that the Osage people had legal title to the territory. You know that white settlers like your father were there illegally. You know all of this as historical fact, as lived experience, as family history, and you choose to tell the story differently. You choose to frame your family's presence on Osage land as legitimate pioneering rather than illegal squatting. You choose to have your father per se that he received word from Washington that the territory would soon be open for settlement, even though no such official authorization existed, even though this was just the rumor that squatters told themselves to justify their theft. You choose to present the Osage people as threatening presences who visit your cabin uninvited and take food without asking, without ever mentioning that your family was living on their land, eating crops grown on their territory, occupying space you had no right to claim. You make these choices consciously. You're not a child recording innocent perceptions. You're an elderly woman who has lived through 60-plus years of American history, who has seen how the story of westward expansion has been told and retold, who understands the power of narrative to shape how people understand their past. And you choose to tell a story that makes white settlers sympathetic and indigenous peoples peripheral. You choose to write a book that millions of children will read and that will teach them to see colonization as adventure rather than theft. Why? Why did Laura Ingalls Wilder make these choices? The question matters because her motivations help us understand not just one woman's literary decisions, but the broader process by which American culture has erased indigenous perspectives and normalized colonization. The simple answer is that Laura needed money. She was writing during the Great Depression, and she was desperate to sell books, and she understood that publishers wanted comforting stories about pioneer family life, not complex moral examinations of colonization and indigenous dispossession. She made commercial decisions designed to produce marketable books. She gave readers what they wanted rather than what they needed to hear. But the answer goes deeper than economics. Laura Ingalls Wilder believed in the mythology of westward expansion. She saw her father as a hero, a man who worked hard and tried to build a better life for his family, and she wanted readers to see him that way too. She could not write a book that portrayed Charles Ingalls as a colonizer, as an illegal squatter, as a participant in indigenous dispossession, because that would destroy the image of Pa that she cherished and that she wanted to preserve for posterity. So she told the story in a way that protected her father's reputation, that made his actions seem justified, that framed the family's presence on Osage land as innocent pioneering rather than theft. And Laura shared the racial prejudices of her time and upbringing. She was raised by parents who feared and distrusted indigenous peoples, who saw them as obstacles rather than human beings with rights and perspectives that deserved consideration. She absorbed those attitudes as a child, and despite living into the 20th century, despite having opportunities to learn different perspectives, she never fully questioned the worldview she inherited. When she wrote about the Osage people, she described them in dehumanizing terms because that is how she saw them, how she had been taught to see them, how American culture in general saw indigenous peoples in the 19th and early 20th centuries. These factors combine to produce a book that is historically inaccurate in its framing, morally problematic in its perspective, and profoundly harmful in its impact on how generations of Americans have understood westward expansion. Little House on the Prairie is not simply a book with some unfortunate racist passages that can be explained away as products of a different era. It is a book that actively perpetuates a false narrative about American history, that erases indigenous perspectives and experiences, that teaches children to accept colonization as natural and inevitable, and even wholesome. And the choices Laura made in writing the book matter, because they reveal how ordinary people participate in systems of oppression. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a particularly evil person. She was not a violent racist who actively advocated for indigenous genocide. She was an ordinary woman trying to make money by writing books about her childhood, trying to honour her father's memory, trying to tell stories that readers would enjoy. But in pursuing those ordinary goals, she made choices that erased indigenous humanity, that justified colonization, that perpetuated racist ideologies that have caused immense harm. This is how systemic racism works, not through cartoon villains who consciously choose evil, but through ordinary people making choices that seem reasonable within their cultural context, but that collectively reinforce oppression. Laura chose to centre white perspectives because that is what publishers wanted and readers expected. She chose to describe indigenous peoples in dehumanising terms because that is how her culture had taught her to see them. She chose to frame colonization as progress because that is the narrative she inherited and never questioned. Each individual choice seems explainable, perhaps even defensible, but the cumulative effect is a book that teaches children to accept genocide as manifest destiny. You close the manuscript, you send it to your publisher. And you do not think about the Osage people who will read your book someday, if any Osage people bother to read it, and see themselves described as frightening savages, as obstacles to progress, as people who were justifiably removed from their own land so that white families like yours could build their little houses on the prairie. You do not think about the generations of American children who will read your book and absorb its lessons about who matters and who does not, whose perspectives deserve centering and whose can be erased, which stories are worth telling and which should be forgotten. You do not think about the harm your book will cause because you do not see it as harmful. You see it as true, as honest, as an accurate representation of your family's experiences on the frontier, and that is precisely the problem. That is why the Little House books are so dangerous, so effective at perpetuating racist ideologies, because they do not seem like propaganda. They seem like family stories, like wholesome entertainment, like beloved classics of children's literature. The racism is woven so deeply into the narrative structure that many readers do not even recognize it as racism. They just absorb the lessons. White settlers were brave pioneers, indigenous peoples were obstacles, colonization was adventure, westward expansion was progress. These lessons become part of how they understand American history, part of their national identity, part of the mythology that makes it possible to avoid confronting the violence and theft that built the United States. Laura Ingalls. Wilder did not create this mythology by herself. She inherited it from her parents, from her culture, from the dominant narratives of her time, but she chose to perpetuate it. She chose to tell the story in a way that reinforced rather than challenged the racist assumptions about indigenous peoples and westward expansion. And those choices have consequences that extend far beyond one woman's literary career. Those choices have shaped American culture, American education, American understanding of history for nearly a century. You're holding a first edition copy of Little House on the Prairie, published in 1935 by Harper and Brothers, and you're turning to page 47, and you're about to read a sentence that countless parents have stumbled over while reading aloud to their children. A sentence that makes the room go quiet, that creates an uncomfortable pause in the bedtime story, that forces families to have conversations they were not expecting to have about racism and genocide and the complicated legacy of beloved books. The sentence comes from the mouth of Mrs. Scott, a neighbour woman who has come to visit the Ingalls cabin. She's talking about the Osage people who live on the land surrounding the white squatters' settlement, and she says, with absolute certainty, with the confidence of someone stating an obvious truth, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. You need to understand what this phrase means, not just the surface meaning, which is clear enough, but the historical context, the ideology it expresses, the violence it has justified. This is not simply an offensive statement. This is a genocidal slogan. It explicitly advocates for the extermination of an entire group of people based solely on their racial and ethnic identity. It says that indigenous peoples have no right to exist, that their deaths are not just acceptable but desirable, that the only way an Indian can be good is to cease living. The phrase originated in the 1860s or 70s during the height of the Indian Wars. It is often attributed to General Philip Sheridan, though he may have been quoting someone else, or it may have emerged organically from the attitudes that permeated white settler society during this period. Regardless of its precise origin, the phrase became a common saying among white Americans who supported the military campaigns against indigenous nations, who believed that westward expansion required the elimination of native peoples, who saw genocide not as a moral horror but as a practical necessity. And Laura Ingalls Wilder put this phrase in her children's book. She placed it in a neighbour's mouth. in a scene where Ma and Mrs. Scott are having a conversation while Pa is away from the cabin, and then she has Ma respond, not with horror or rejection, but with nervous agreement, saying that she would be glad when the Indians are gone, that she does not feel safe with them so near, that she will be relieved when the government removes them. Pa, when he returns, offers a mild objection. He says that Indians are people and that they have been treated badly by the government, that they would be peaceful if left alone. This is the defence that some readers point to when arguing that the Little House books are not actually racist, that Laura includes voices questioning the treatment of indigenous peoples, that Pa represents a more enlightened perspective than his neighbours. But you need to look more carefully at what Pa actually says and does not say. He defends Indians in abstract terms, as people who deserve fair treatment from the government. But he does not question his own presence on their land. He does not acknowledge that his family is part of the problem, that their illegal squatting is one of the reasons the Osage feel threatened, that white settlers like himself are the source of the danger rather than the victims of it. His defence of Indians is paternalistic, distant, theoretical. He feels sorry for them in the same way he might feel sorry for any group of people being treated unfairly, but he does not see them as equals, as neighbours whose rights he is violating, as human beings whose perspectives deserve equal consideration with his own desires and needs. And critically, Laura as author never explicitly rejects Mrs. Scott's genocidal statement. She presents it as one viewpoint among several, as an opinion that exists on the frontier, as something that some people believed. She does not have a character say that wishing for the death of an entire group of people is morally wrong. She does not use her narrative voice to create distance between herself and Mrs. Scott's statement. She simply reports it, includes it in the dialogue, and moves on with the story as if advocating for genocide is just another perspective that reasonable people might hold. This narrative choice is significant, because children reading this book absorb not just the words the characters speak, but the authorial attitude toward those words. When Laura presents the only good Indian is a dead Indian, without explicit condemnation, when she has sympathetic characters like Ma agree with the sentiment, when she has Pa offer only weak and abstract objections, she's teaching young readers that this kind of genocidal thinking was normal, understandable, perhaps even justified given the circumstances. She is normalizing racism and violence. She's making genocide seem like a reasonable response to the challenges of frontier life. You turn the page and continue reading, and you find more. You find descriptions of Osage people that consistently dehumanize them, that render them as frightening, alien, incomprehensible. You find a scene where two Osage men enter the Ingalls cabin without knocking and take cornbread from the table without asking permission. The scene is written to create fear and tension. Ma is described as frozen, terrified, unable to move. The girls huddle together in frightened silence. The Osage men are described with bold, fierce faces, with eyes that are black and still and glittering, with bodies that smell of skunk grease and wild animal hides. Every detail is chosen to make the Osage men seem threatening, to justify Ma's fear, to make the reader feel relief when the men finally leave without harming the family. And nowhere in the scene does Laura acknowledge the perspective that would completely change how we understand what's happening. These Osage men are walking through their own territory, approaching a cabin that should not exist on their land, taking food that white squatters are growing on Osage property. From the Osage perspective, they have every right to enter this cabin and take whatever they want. The cabin itself is an act of theft. Every piece of cornbread the Ingalls family eats is food grown on stolen land. The Osage men taking cornbread without asking are not committing theft. They are asserting ownership of resources on their own territory. But Laura does not write the scene this way. She writes it entirely from Ma's perspective, centering white fear and white vulnerability while rendering Osage actions as inexplicable, aggressive, frightening. She makes the reader sympathise with the colonizers and fear the colonized. She inverts the actual power dynamics, presenting the Ingalls family as vulnerable victims threatened by indigenous peoples, when the historical reality is that white squatters were the threat, the danger, the source of violence and dispossession. This is how racism works in literature. Not through crude stereotypes and explicit slurs, though the Little House books contain those too, but through narrative perspective, through whose fears matter and whose can be ignored, through which viewpoint gets centred and which gets erased. Laura Ingalls. Wilder teaches readers to see the world through white settlers' eyes, to identify with their hopes and fears and struggles, to understand their actions as justified responses to difficult circumstances. And in doing so, she makes it almost impossible for readers to see the Osage perspective, to understand what colonization meant for the people whose land was being stolen, to recognise that the pioneers were participants in genocide. You're a scholar in the 21st century, and you are compiling a list of every instance in the Little House series where Indigenous peoples are described, where their actions are interpreted, where their presence in the narrative serves some purpose in Laura's storytelling. And as you work through the books, as you document each passage and analyse the language Laura uses, you begin to see a pattern that is so consistent, so systematic, that it cannot possibly be accidental. Indigenous peoples in the Little House books are never fully human. They are never individuals with names and personalities and motivations that readers can understand. They are always a collective, an undifferentiated mass, the Indians, who move through the landscape in groups, who speak in guttural sounds that are not translated or explained, who appear suddenly and disappear mysteriously like forces of nature rather than human beings making deliberate choices. When Laura describes their physical appearance, she uses language that emphasises difference, that makes them seem alien and frightening. Their skin is described as dark, red, copper-coloured, always with an emphasis on how different it looks from white skin. Their hair is black and coarse. Their eyes are dark and expressionless, or glittering with some emotion that Laura never names or explains because she does not imagine what Osage people might be thinking or feeling when they encounter white squatters on their land. Their clothing is described as primitive, made of animal skins and decorated with feathers and paint in ways that seem exotic, savage, uncivilized. The language Laura uses is the language of dehumanization. She describes Osage people the way you might describe animals, focusing on physical characteristics, movements, sounds, without ever entering their consciousness or imagining their interior lives. When the Osage men enter the cabin and take cornbread, Laura describes what they do, but never why they do it, never what they might be thinking, never how they perceive the Ingalls family, or what they make of these white squatters living on Osage land. They remain objects in Laura's narrative, things that happen to the Ingalls family rather than subjects with their own agency and perspective. And the few times Laura attributes any emotional state to Indigenous peoples, it is always negative, always threatening. They are angry, fierce, dangerous, unpredictable. They are never shown as loving parents caring for their children, never as communities celebrating together, never as human beings experiencing the full range of human emotions and relationships. They exist in Laura's books solely in relation to white settlers, solely as sources of fear or fascination, or impediment to white progress. You document a passage where Laura describes hearing Indigenous people passing near the cabin at night. She writes about lying in bed listening to the sounds, to the voices speaking in a language she cannot understand, to the movement of horses and people travelling through the darkness. And the way she describes this experience is entirely through the lens of fear. She's frightened by what she hears. Ma is frightened. Even Pa, who claims not to fear Indians, is alert and watchful. The passage creates suspense, creates danger, makes the reader feel the same fear the Ingalls family feels. But if you shift perspective for just a moment, if you imagine this same scene from the Osage viewpoint, everything changes. Osage families are travelling through their own territory, moving between villages or returning from hunts, using trails they have used for generations. And they pass a cabin that should not be there, a structure built by illegal squatters, a symbol of the white invasion that is destroying their nation. Perhaps they are angry about this cabin. Perhaps they are frightened themselves, knowing that white settlers bring violence and disease and dispossession. Perhaps they are simply tired, trying to reach their destination, wanting nothing to do with the white families who have invaded their homeland. We cannot know what the Osage people were thinking or feeling, because Laura never tells us. She never imagines it. She presents their presence as inherently frightening, as a threat to white safety, without ever acknowledging that from the Osage perspective, the Ingalls cabin is the threat. The white settlers are the danger. The fear runs in the opposite direction from how Laura describes it. You document another passage where Pa tells stories about Indian attacks, about settlers being killed, about the dangers of living in Indian country. These stories serve a clear narrative purpose. They build tension. They justify white fear. They make the eventual removal of the Osage seem like a relief rather than an injustice. Pa's stories teach Laura and her sisters and the readers to see Indigenous peoples as violent threats that need to be removed for white families to be safe. But what Pa's stories never mention, what Laura's books never explore, is why Indigenous peoples might attack white settlers. The books never discuss the decades of broken treaties, the systematic theft of Indigenous land, the military campaigns against native nations, the bounties that some states paid for Indian scalps, the deliberate distribution of smallpox-infected blankets, the massacres of Indigenous women and children, the forced relocations that killed thousands through starvation and exposure. The books never provide the context that would make Indigenous resistance comprehensible, that would show attacks on white settlers as acts of self-defense rather than unprovoked savagery. This is the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of the Little House books. They present westward expansion from only one perspective, the white settler's perspective, and they systematically exclude the Indigenous viewpoint that would challenge the narrative of innocent pioneering. They make readers identify with white characters and fear Indigenous peoples. They teach children to accept the colonizers' version of history without question, to internalize the belief that westward expansion was natural and necessary and good, that Indigenous peoples were obstacles to progress who needed to be removed for civilization to advance. You finish compiling your list, and the pattern is undeniable. Across all 9 books in the series, Indigenous peoples appear dozens of times, and not once are they portrayed with full humanity. Not once does Laura enter their consciousness or imagine their perspective. Not once does she present them as complex individuals with hopes and fears and dreams that are as valid as her own. They remain throughout the series what they were in Little House on the Prairie, the frightening other, the obstacle, the problem that white settlement must overcome. You're sitting across from Rose Wilder Lane in her apartment in New York City in 1932, and you are watching her work on your manuscript, and you're beginning to understand that the book that will be published under your name alone is actually a collaboration, a negotiation between your memories and Rose's literary ambitions, between what you wrote and what Rose thinks will sell, between the story you wanted to tell and the story publishers want to buy. Rose is your daughter, 45 years old, an established writer with her own career, with connections to publishers and editors that you do not have. She has been successful. She has written novels and magazine articles that paid well. She knows the business of publishing in ways you do not, and she has offered to help you turn your autobiography, the manuscript called Pioneer Girl that every publisher rejected, into something marketable, something that might actually earn money for both of you. You watch her cross out entire paragraphs. You watch her rewrite your sentences, changing your plain language into something more polished, more literary, more appealing to readers who want beautiful prose rather than simple storytelling. You watch her restructure scenes, adding dialogue and description and dramatic tension where you had simply reported what happened. She's making your memories into fiction, into a novel that reads like literature rather than autobiography. And you watch her make decisions about the Indigenous peoples in your story. You wrote about the Osage people who lived on the Kansas land where your family squatted. You described encounters with them, moments of fear and confusion, and the eventual relief when your family left. But your original descriptions were straightforward, factual, the observations of a child filtered through adult memory. Rose is transforming those descriptions into something else, something more dramatic, more frightening, more aligned with the conventions of pioneer literature where Indians are always threats and white settlers are always vulnerable. She adds details you did not include. She changes your language to emphasize the frightening aspects of Osage appearance and behavior. She structures scenes to maximize tension and fear. When you described Osage men entering the cabin, you reported the facts. They came in, they looked around, they took some food, they left. Rose rewrites the scene to focus on Ma's terror, on the girl's frozen silence, on the feeling of helplessness and danger. She makes the scene serve the narrative purpose of justifying white fear, of making readers sympathize with your family's position, even though your family was illegally occupying Osage land. You let her make these changes. You need the money too badly to object. You trust Rose's judgment about what will sell, and besides, the changes do not feel entirely wrong to you. You were frightened of Indians when you were a child. Ma was frightened. The fear was real, even if the source of that fear was your own family's illegal presence on indigenous land rather than any actual threat from the Osage people. Rose is simply emphasizing what you remember feeling, translating emotion into narrative, making the reader feel what you felt without necessarily explaining the full context that produced those feelings. But there are moments when Rose's changes make you uncomfortable, when she adds phrases that seem too harsh, descriptions that make the Osage sound more savage than you remember, dialogue that expresses racist sentiments more explicitly than you would have chosen. You start to object, to suggest softening the language, but Rose explains that this is what readers expect, this is how pioneer stories are told, this is the convention of the genre, and you are not experienced enough with publishing to argue, not confident enough in your own literary judgment to insist that your version is better. So you agree. You let Rose rewrite your memories into the narrative that will become Little House on the Prairie. You sign off on descriptions that dehumanize indigenous peoples, on scenes that center white fear without acknowledging indigenous perspective, on a framing that makes colonization seem like innocent pioneering. You make these choices together with Rose, and while Rose may bear more responsibility for the specific language because she did most of the rewriting, you bear responsibility too because you agreed to the changes, because you allowed your story to be told this way, because you never insisted that the book acknowledge what your family actually was. Illegal squatters participating in indigenous dispossession. The book is published in 1932 as Little House in the Big Woods, and it is successful enough that Harper and Brothers wants more. So you and Rose repeat the process with the Kansas story, with Little House on the Prairie. And this time the collaboration is smoother because you have learned what publishers want, what readers expect, how to tell pioneer stories in ways that will sell. You have learned to center white perspectives and marginalize indigenous ones. You have learned to emphasize the hardships white settlers faced, without spending much time on the vastly greater hardships experienced by indigenous peoples being dispossessed of their lands. You have learned to write books that American readers will love because they confirm what those readers already believe about westward expansion and manifest destiny and the righteousness of white settlement. And you have learned not to question too deeply what you are doing, not to examine too carefully the gap between the historical reality and the narrative you are creating, not to worry too much about indigenous readers who might someday read your books and see themselves portrayed as savage obstacles rather than human beings whose lands were stolen. You push those concerns aside because you need the money, because you want the success, because it feels good to be a published author after decades of obscurity and financial struggle. The Little House books make you famous. They make you moderately wealthy. They give you a legacy that will last long after your death. And they do all of this by telling a story that erases indigenous humanity, that justifies colonization, that teaches generations of American children to accept genocide as natural and necessary and even wholesome. You made choices that led to this outcome. Rose made choices too. The publishers made choices. The editors made choices. Every person involved in producing these books shares responsibility for their content and their impact. But you are the author whose name appears on the cover. You are the one who claimed these stories as your own. You're the one who chose to tell your family's history in a way that centered white pioneers and marginalized indigenous peoples. And that choice, made in collaboration with your daughter in the 1930s for reasons that seemed practical and reasonable at the time, has consequences that extend far beyond what you imagined when you first put pen to paper and began writing about your childhood on the prairie. You're a librarian named Helen Sewell, and you're sitting at your desk in a public library somewhere in America in 1952, and you have just finished reading Little House on the Prairie aloud to a group of children during story hour, and one of the children, a little girl perhaps 7 or 8 years old, has raised her hand and asked you a question that you do not know how to answer. The girl says, "Miss Sewell, why does the book say there were no people, only Indians? Aren't Indians people?" You freeze. You look down at the book in your hands, at the page where the sentence appears, the sentence you read aloud just minutes ago without thinking, without questioning, without recognizing the problem until this child pointed it out to you. There were no people. Only Indians lived there. You have read this sentence dozens of times, perhaps hundreds of times over the 17 years since the book was published. You have read it to countless children, and until this moment you never stop to consider what it actually says, what it teaches, what it does to the children who hear it. You try to form an answer. You tell the girl that of course Indians are people, that the author probably did not mean it the way it sounds, that it was just an unfortunate way of phrasing things. But even as you say these words, you know they are inadequate, because the sentence does not sound like an accident. It sounds like a clear statement. There were no people, only Indians. The grammar is explicit. The meaning is unambiguous. And no amount of explanation can undo what the sentence teaches to children who read it without critical analysis, who absorb its lessons before they are old enough to question them. You think about this encounter for days afterward. You discuss it with other librarians. Some of them dismiss your concerns, telling you that you are reading too much into a single sentence, that Laura Ingalls Wilder is a beloved author whose books have brought joy to millions of children, that you should not ruin Story Hour by turning every little thing into a controversy. But other librarians tell you that they have noticed the same problem, that they have struggled with how to read that sentence aloud, that they have seen Native American children in their libraries flinch or look down at the floor when that passage is read, that they have wondered whether these books should continue to be featured so prominently in children's sections, and you decide to write a letter, not to your colleagues, not to a journal, but to the publisher, to Harper and Row, the company that printed this book and has been reprinting it steadily for 17 years. You write to the editor-in-chief, a woman named Ursula Nordstrom, and you tell her about the sentence on page 3, about the child who asked why Indians are not people, about your growing conviction that this sentence is harmful, that it teaches racism to children, that it needs to be changed. You do not know if your letter will make any difference. Publishers are not known for revising successful books based on complaints from librarians. The Little House series has sold millions of copies. It generates steady revenue. Why would Harper and Row risk upsetting loyal readers by acknowledging that there is a problem with one of their most profitable properties? But you mail the letter anyway, because you cannot keep reading that sentence to children, because you cannot participate in teaching young readers that Indigenous peoples are not human, because someone needs to say something, and if you do not, then who will? The letter is not preserved in any archive. We do not know exactly what you wrote or how you phrased your objection, but we know that Ursula Nordstrom received a complaint about the "no people, only Indians" sentence in 1952, because we have Nordstrom's response. We have the letter she wrote to Laura Ingalls Wilder, forwarding the complaint and asking for permission to revise the problematic sentence in future editions. And we have Laura's reply, dated May 1952, written when she was 85 years old, nearly 20 years after the book was first published. Laura writes, "You are perfectly right about the fault in Little House on the Prairie, and have my permission to make the correction you suggest. It was a stupid blunder of mine. Of course, Indians are people, and I did not intend to imply they were not." You need to sit with this response for a moment. You need to understand what it says and what it does not say. Laura acknowledges that the sentence is a fault, a blunder, a mistake. She grants permission for revision. She states explicitly that Indians are people and that she did not intend to imply otherwise. This is the defense that her supporters point to when arguing that Laura was not really racist, that the problematic sentence was just an unfortunate error that she corrected as soon as it was brought to her attention. But look more carefully at the language Laura uses. She calls it a stupid blunder, as if the sentence were a typo, an accidental grammatical error. A careless slip of the pen rather than a deliberate expression of the worldview that shaped the entire book. She says she did not intend to imply that Indians were not people, as if intention matters more than impact, as if the harm caused by 17 years of children reading that sentence can be erased by clarifying that she meant something different. Laura does not apologise. She does not express regret for the harm the sentence has caused to Indigenous readers, to Native American children forced to read a book that denies their ancestors' humanity. She does not acknowledge that the sentence expresses a racist ideology, that it reflects the dehumanizing attitudes toward Indigenous peoples that permeated her upbringing and her culture. She simply calls it a blunder, grants permission to fix it, and moves on as if the matter is now resolved, and the revision that follows is superficial at best. In 1953, Harper & Row publishes new editions of Little House on the Prairie, with the sentence changed to read, "There were no settlers, only Indians lived there." The explicit statement that Indians are not people is removed, but the implicit hierarchy remains. The revised sentence still suggests that Indians are not settlers, not legitimate inhabitants, not rightful occupants of the land. It still creates a distinction between white people who are settlers, a term that implies intention and right and purpose, and Indians who are simply there, a term that implies transience, accident, lack of legitimate claim. The revision does not fix the fundamental problem. It does not acknowledge that the Osage people were the rightful owners of the Kansas Territory, that white families like the Ingalls were illegal squatters, that the entire premise of the book rests on erasing Indigenous land rights and presenting colonization as innocent pioneering. The revision is a cosmetic change designed to address the most obvious and egregious example of racist language while leaving the underlying ideology intact. You're reading the revised edition of Little House on the Prairie, published in 1953 with the corrected sentence, and you are continuing through the book looking for other problematic passages, and you're finding them everywhere, because the No People Only Indian sentence was not an isolated blunder. It was the thesis statement for an entire book, saturated with racist depictions of Indigenous peoples, and while Harper & Row corrected that one sentence, they left everything else unchanged. You turn to page 47, and you find Mrs. Scott's genocidal statement still there. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. You read the passage where Osage men enter the cabin and take cornbread, described entirely through the lens of white fear, without any acknowledgement of Osage perspective. You read descriptions of Osage people with bold, fierce faces and glittering eyes, language designed to make them seem threatening and alien. You read Ma's expressions of fear and relief when Indians finally leave the territory, presented as natural and justified rather than as the racist attitudes they are. All of this remains in the revised edition. Harper & Row changed one sentence and left the rest of the book exactly as it was. And this selective revision reveals something important about how publishing houses handle racism in profitable books. They are willing to make minimal changes to address the most obvious complaints, the passages so egregious that they cannot be defended even by supporters of the book. But they are not willing to undertake the comprehensive revision that would be necessary to remove the racist ideology that permeates the entire narrative. Why? Because comprehensive revision would require acknowledging that the book's fundamental perspective is the problem. It would require admitting that centering white settlers' experiences while marginalizing Indigenous peoples is itself a form of racism. It would require rewriting the book from the ground up, perhaps even acknowledging that the book should not have been published in its current form in the first place. And publishers do not want to admit this about their successful properties, about the books that generate steady revenue, about the classics that parents and teachers trust and recommend. So they make the minimal revision necessary to deflect criticism. They change the most offensive sentence and leave everything else in place. And then they continue printing and selling the book, confident that most readers will not notice the other problematic passages, that the revision of the No People sentence will be enough to satisfy complaints, that the Little House series can continue to be marketed as wholesome family entertainment despite its perpetuation of racist stereotypes and colonial mythology. You are Laura Ingalls Wilder, and you are 85 years old, and you have just agreed to the revision of your book, and you're feeling relieved that the matter has been resolved so easily, and you're not thinking about the deeper implications of what that sentence revealed about your worldview and your work. You tell yourself that it was just a careless phrase, that you never meant to suggest Indians were not people, that anyone who reads the full book can see that you portray Prairie as defending Indians and questioning their treatment by the government. You point to the passages where Prairie says Indians would be peaceful if left alone, where Prairie criticises government policies, where Prairie shows respect for Osage people, even while living illegally on their land. You believe these passages prove that you are not really racist, that your intentions were good even if one sentence was poorly worded. But you do not examine why you wrote that sentence in the first place. You do not ask yourself what it reveals about the assumptions you carried, from childhood into old age, about the worldview that made it possible for you to write a sentence denying Indigenous humanity without recognising it as problematic until a reader complained 17 years later. You do not consider what it means that you, an intelligent and educated woman, who lived through decades of changing attitudes about race and rights, never noticed the problem with that sentence on your own, never questioned it during the writing process or the editing process or the 17 years it remained in print before someone objected. You do not think about the Native American children who read that sentence during those 17 years, who absorbed its lesson that they are not people, that their ancestors did not count as legitimate inhabitants of the land, that white settlers had every right to take what belonged to indigenous nations. You do not think about the damage that sentence caused, the racist ideology it reinforced, the generations of readers who learned from your book that indigenous peoples are something less than fully human. You think you have fixed the problem. You changed the sentence. You clarified that you did not mean to imply Indians were not people. And now you can move on, secure in the knowledge that you are not a racist, that your books are not harmful, that the Little House series will continue to be beloved by readers who see them as heartwarming tales of pioneer family life, rather than as texts that perpetuate colonial mythology and indigenous erasure. But changing one sentence does not undo 17 years of harm. It does not address the fundamental problems with how you portrayed indigenous peoples throughout the series. It does not acknowledge your participation in systems of oppression, your role in perpetuating racist ideologies, your responsibility as an author who shaped how millions of readers understand American history and westward expansion. The revision is too little, too late. And your response to the complaint, your characterization of the sentence as a stupid blunder rather than a revealing expression of deep-seated racism, shows that you never truly understood the problem. You thought it was about one sentence, but it was always about much more than that. It was about perspective, about whose voices matter and whose can be ignored, about which stories get told and which get erased, about how literature teaches children to see the world and their place in it. You're a literature professor in the 21st century, and you're teaching a course on children's literature and historical memory, and you have assigned your students to analyse the revision of Little House on the Prairie, to compare the original 1935 edition with the 1953 revised edition, and to write papers examining what the revision reveals about how American culture handles racism in beloved texts. Your students come back with observations that surprise you. They notice that the revision happened in 1953, 8 years after the end of World War II, 8 years after the Holocaust forced many Americans to confront what happens when dehumanizing ideologies are taken to their logical conclusion. They notice that the revision happened during the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, when Black Americans were beginning to challenge segregation and demand equal rights, when conversations about racial justice were becoming more prominent in American public discourse. They noticed that the revision happened at a moment when some Americans were beginning to question the racist assumptions that had been taken for granted in previous generations. But they also noticed that the revision was minimal, superficial, defensive. Laura's response characterizes the problem as a stupid blunder rather than a systemic issue. The publisher changes one sentence and leaves everything else intact. There is no broader reckoning with the racism in the Little House series, no comprehensive revision of how indigenous peoples are portrayed, no acknowledgement that the entire narrative framework is problematic. The revision addresses the symptom, the most egregious example of racist language, but ignores the disease, the colonial ideology that permeates every page. Your students ask, why? Why did it take 17 years for anyone to complain about that sentence? Why did the revision only address one sentence instead of the broader problems? Why did Laura and her publisher treat this as a minor error to be quickly fixed rather than a serious problem requiring deep examination? You tell them that these questions reveal how racism works in American culture, how it can be so normalized that intelligent, educated people do not recognize it as racist until someone points it out, how beloved texts can perpetuate harmful ideologies while being celebrated as classics, how institutions like publishing houses prioritize profit over justice, willing to make minimal changes to deflect criticism, but unwilling to undertake the comprehensive reforms that would be necessary to truly address the problems in their catalogue. You tell them that the 17 years of silence before the complaint reveal something crucial, that for white readers in the 1930s and 40s, the sentence, "There were no people, only Indians," did not seem problematic. It aligned with what they already believed about indigenous peoples, about westward expansion, about American history. The sentence confirmed their worldview rather than challenging it. So they read past it without question, absorbed its lesson without critique, passed the book along to their children and students without recognizing the harm it was causing. And you tell them that indigenous readers almost certainly noticed the problem immediately, that Native American children forced to read this book in school saw the sentence for what it was, a denial of their humanity, an erasure of their ancestors, a perpetuation of the genocidal ideologies that had justified centuries of violence and dispossession. But indigenous voices were marginalized in American culture in the 1930s and 40s. Indigenous children who objected to the book were probably told they were being too sensitive, that they were misunderstanding the author's intent, that they should not ruin a beloved story by making it about race. Their complaints were dismissed or ignored, so the sentence remained in print for 17 years, until a white librarian finally noticed the problem and had enough social capital to get the publisher to pay attention. This is how systemic racism persists, not through conscious malice necessarily, but through institutional inertia, through the privileging of white perspectives over indigenous ones, through the assumption that books beloved by white readers must be harmless even when they perpetuate ideologies that harm marginalized communities. The Little House series continued to be published, recommended, taught, and celebrated for 17 years with that sentence on page 3, because the people with power in publishing and education did not see it as a problem, and the people who did see it as a problem did not have the power to demand change. The revision in 1953 represents a tiny shift, a minimal acknowledgement that something might be wrong with how the book portrays indigenous peoples. But the fact that the revision was so limited, so defensive, so reluctant to engage with the deeper problems, shows how far American culture still had to go in confronting its history of racism and colonization. Laura Ingalls, Wilder could acknowledge that one sentence was a blunder, without examining what that sentence revealed about her own worldview. Harper and Row could change one sentence without acknowledging that the entire book perpetuates colonial mythology. Teachers and librarians could continue using the revised edition without grappling with the fact that the revisions were cosmetic, that the fundamental problems remained unaddressed, and for decades after the revision, the Little House books continued to be taught as wholesome family entertainment, as valuable historical fiction, as classics of American children's literature. The 1953 revision became a defense mechanism. When someone raised concerns about racism in the books, supporters could point to the revision and say, "But that sentence was fixed decades ago." Laura herself acknowledged it was wrong. What more do you want? As if changing one sentence erased all the other problematic content, as if Laura's characterization of the problem as a blunder meant that systemic racism was not an issue, as if the minimal revision was sufficient response to 17 years of teaching children that indigenous peoples were not really people. Your students understand now. They see how the revision of Little House on the Prairie is not a success story about an author correcting a mistake, but a case study in how American culture has consistently minimized racism in beloved texts, how institutions resist comprehensive reform, how white voices are privileged in decisions about what is and is not acceptable in literature. They see that 17 years of silence followed by a superficial revision is not accountability. It is damage control. It is the bare minimum response designed to deflect criticism while protecting the profitable status quo. You're reading through Laura Ingalls Wilder's original Pioneer Girl manuscript again, the one written in 1930 before Rose transformed it into the published Little House series, and you're making a list of everything that appears in the manuscript but was cut from the children's books. And as your list grows longer, as you document passage after passage that was removed or softened or altered, you begin to see a pattern in what Laura and Rose chose to delete. They deleted the poverty, the real, grinding, desperate poverty that defined much of the Ingalls family's frontier experience. In Pioneer Girl, Laura writes about her family receiving government relief flour because they were starving after grasshopper plagues destroyed their crops. She writes about Charles signing a sworn statement declaring the family wholly without means. She writes about Caroline grinding wheat in a coffee mill until her hands bled because they could not afford to buy flour. She writes about winters so harsh that the family survived on potatoes and salt pork, about summers when there was not enough food, about the constant struggle just to avoid starvation. Most of this was cut from the published books. The Little House series acknowledges that the family was poor, that pioneer life was hard, that there were lean times and difficult winters. But the books soften the reality, transform desperate poverty into noble simplicity, present deprivation as character-building hardship rather than as the brutal struggle for survival that it actually was. The books make poverty seem almost wholesome, as if doing without luxuries teaches valuable lessons about self-reliance and gratitude. They do not show you what it feels like to be genuinely hungry, to watch your children go to bed with empty stomachs, to know that if the next crop fails, your family might not survive the winter. Why delete this? Why transform real poverty into romanticized simplicity? Because Depression-era readers did not want to read about frontier families who were as desperate and struggling as they themselves were. They wanted to read about pioneers who overcame hardship through pluck and determination, who built successful lives through hard work and faith. They wanted comfort, inspiration, hope. They did not want to be reminded that sometimes hard work is not enough, that good people can do everything right and still fail, that the frontier killed as many families as it rewarded. You continue reading, and you find deletions about the Osage people. In Pioneer Girl, Laura includes more details about white settlers' attitudes toward indigenous peoples, more explicit expressions of the racism that permeated frontier communities. She writes about conversations where settlers discuss what they would do if Indians attacked, where they fantasize about violence, where they express views that are genocidal in their implications. Much of this was cut or softened in the published books. Mrs. Scott's "Only good Indian is a dead Indian" statement remains, but many other examples of settler racism were removed, presumably because editors thought they were too extreme, too revealing of the violence that underpinned white settlement. And you find something else that was deleted, any acknowledgement that the Ingalls family knew they were illegal squatters. In Pioneer Girl, Laura is less consistent in maintaining the fiction that Charles had, word from Washington, that the territory would soon be opened. There are passages where it is clear that the family understood they were occupying Osage land without permission, that they were gambling that the government would eventually legalize their occupation, that they knew they might be forced to leave. In the published books, this ambiguity is removed. Parr's claim that he received authorization is presented as fact, rather than as the self-justifying story that illegal squatters told themselves. The books erase any suggestion that the Ingalls family understood themselves to be doing something legally questionable. This deletion matters enormously, because it transforms the moral framework of the entire story. If Charles believed he had government authorization to settle on the Kansas Prairie, then his family's presence there was an innocent mistake based on miscommunication. But if Charles knew he was illegally squatting on Osage land and chose to do it anyway, gambling that the government would eventually side with white settlers over indigenous treaty rights, Then his actions become a deliberate choice to participate in colonization, a calculated decision to steal land and hope to get away with it. Laura and Rose chose to present Charles as innocent rather than culpable. They chose to protect his reputation, to preserve the image of Parr as a hard-working pioneer rather than as an illegal squatter and participant in indigenous dispossession. And this choice has shaped how generations of readers understand the Ingalls family and westward expansion more broadly. Readers see Parr as a hero because the books present him that way, because the narrative choices Laura and Rose made systematically deleted evidence that would complicate that heroic image. You turn to another section of Pioneer Girl and you find material that was deleted about the economic forces driving westward expansion. Laura writes about land speculation, about men who claimed multiple homesteads illegally and sold them for profit, about the railroads that were given millions of acres of public land and used it to enrich private investors, about the government policies that prioritized corporate interests over both white settlers and indigenous peoples. She writes about a frontier that was not primarily about individual families seeking opportunity, but about large-scale economic exploitation, where ordinary people like her father were often pawns in schemes designed to benefit the wealthy and powerful. Almost none of this appears in the published books. The Little House series presents westward expansion as a story of individual families making individual choices, pursuing individual dreams. The books erase the structural forces, the economic systems, the government policies that shaped how settlement happened and who benefited from it. They make the frontier seem like a level playing field where anyone willing to work hard could succeed, when the reality was that the game was rigged from the start, designed to transfer wealth from indigenous peoples and poor settlers to railroad companies, land speculators, and political insiders. Why delete this? Because it complicates the mythology. Because it reveals that the pioneers readers want to celebrate were often victims themselves, manipulated by economic forces beyond their control, used as tools in a massive land grab that enriched a few while leaving most settlers in continued poverty. Because it shows that westward expansion was not primarily about freedom and opportunity, but about capitalism and exploitation, about powerful interests using government policy to seize indigenous land and extract profit from both the land and the people who settled it. Laura and Rose made choices about what to include and what to delete. They chose to preserve the mythology of noble pioneers overcoming hardship through character and determination. They chose to erase the evidence of poverty, of illegal squatting, of economic exploitation, of settler racism beyond the most unavoidable examples. They chose to tell a story that American readers wanted to hear, rather than the fuller, messier, more morally complicated truth that would have challenged readers' assumptions about their own history. You're examining what is perhaps the most significant deletion from Laura Ingalls Wilder's story, and you're realizing that what was cut from the Little House books is not just passages or details, but an entire person, a baby boy, a brother, a son who lived for 9 months and 26 days and then died, and whose death was so devastating that Laura could not bring herself to write about it in the children's books, could not find a way to fit his brief life and tragic death into the narrative of pioneer resilience she was constructing. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. The family called him Freddie. He was born in November of 1875 in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, during a period when the family was desperately poor, when grasshoppers had destroyed 2 years of crops, when Charles and Caroline were barely keeping their children fed. Freddie was small from birth, weak, struggling. He never thrived. He had episodes where his body would go rigid and shake, seizures probably caused by malnutrition or other complications that 19th century medicine could not diagnose or treat. In August of 1876, when the family was fleeing Minnesota after 3 years of crop failures, when they stopped at Charles's brother Peter's farm on their way to Iowa, Freddie developed severe diarrhea. In the heat of summer, with contaminated water and food, with no medical treatment available beyond laudanum to ease his pain, the baby's body could not recover. He died on August 27th, 1876, 9 months and 26 days old. The cause listed on his death certificate was misspelled as diarrhea, but you know it means diarrhea, one of the most common killers of infants in the 19th century, a preventable disease that claimed thousands of babies' lives every year. Freddie was buried in an unmarked grave on Peter's property. 12 years later, the Zumbro River flooded and destroyed Peter's house, and the family moved away, and no one remembered exactly where the baby was buried. Freddie's grave was lost to history. His short life was forgotten by everyone except the family members who survived him. And when Laura wrote the Little House books in the 1930s, she chose not to include him at all. You read through all 9 published books in the series, and Freddie does not appear in any of them, not in On the Banks of Plum Creek, which covers the Minnesota years when he was born and died, not in By the Shores of Silver Lake, which begins 3 years after his death, not in any of the other books. Laura simply erased him from the published narrative, removing him so completely that millions of readers have read the entire series without ever knowing that the Ingalls family had a son, that Mary and Laura and Carrie had a brother, that Carolyn carried the grief of his death for 48 years until her own death in 1924. Why? Why would Laura erase her own brother from literary existence? The question has troubled scholars for decades. Some argue that it was too painful, that the memory of Freddie's death was so traumatic that Laura could not bear to write about it in detail, that she chose silence over confronting the grief. Others argue that Freddie's death did not fit the narrative arc of the Little House series, which is fundamentally about survival and resilience, about a family that overcomes hardship and builds successful lives. A baby who dies from poverty-related disease complicates that narrative. It introduces a tragedy that cannot be overcome, a loss that hard work and determination could not prevent. A reminder that sometimes pioneer families failed not because they lacked character, but because the frontier was genuinely deadly. And being poor in the 19th century meant watching your children die from diseases that could not be treated. In Pioneer Girl, the unpublished autobiography, Laura does mention Freddie, but only briefly. She writes, "Little brother was not well. One awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead." 2 sentences. That is all she could manage. The rest of the manuscript moves on quickly, describing the family's journey to Iowa, their work at a hotel in Burr Oak, the continuation of their lives after this devastating loss. Even in the adult autobiography, Laura could not or would not explore the full weight of Freddie's death, could not describe what it meant to the family, could not examine how poverty and frontier conditions killed her brother. And when Rose helped Laura transform Pioneer Girl into the children's novels, Freddie was cut entirely. Perhaps Laura asked for this deletion. Perhaps Rose suggested it. Perhaps the editors at Harper & Brothers decided that a dead baby was too depressing for children's literature. We do not know who made the decision or exactly why, but the effect is clear. The published Little House books present a sanitized version of the Ingalls family history, where babies are born but do not die, where poverty exists but does not kill, where the frontier is harsh but ultimately survivable if you have enough grit and faith. Freddie's erasure reveals the gap between the mythology Laura constructed and the reality she lived. The mythology requires that the pioneer family succeed, that they overcome all obstacles, that their story have a happy ending. But the reality is that the Ingalls family experienced devastating losses, that they were often on the edge of starvation, that they participated in the dispossession of indigenous peoples and were themselves victims of economic systems that exploited poor settlers. The reality is complicated, morally ambiguous, full of tragedy and failure alongside the moments of joy and triumph. Laura chose mythology over reality. She chose to tell the story that readers wanted to hear rather than the full truth of what her family experienced. And in doing so, she erased her brother from history, removed him from the record so thoroughly that most people who can recite the names of all the Ingalls daughters cannot tell you anything about Charles Frederick Ingalls, the only son, the brother who was loved and lost and then systematically deleted from the narrative as if he had never existed at all. You are Carolyn Ingalls, and you're 70 years old, and it is the year 1910, and your daughter Laura has come to visit you in De Smet, South Dakota, and you're sitting together in the parlour of the house Charles built before he died, and somehow the conversation has turned to Kansas, to the time the family spent on Osage land when Laura was a toddler, and Laura is asking you questions about what you remember from those years, and you tell her something you have never been able to forget, something that has haunted you for 40 years. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. Laura knows what you mean. She knows you're talking about her brother, the baby who died in Minnesota 6 years after the family left Kansas, the child she barely remembers because she was only 9 years old when he died. But you are connecting his death to Kansas, to the poverty that began during those years as an illegal squatter on Osage land, to the crop failures and the desperation that followed, to the chain of events that led to Freddie being born into a family that could not adequately feed him, that led to his death from a disease that killed infants whose mothers were malnourished and could not produce enough milk. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived, if he had survived. You would have had the son Charles wanted so desperately, the boy who would have carried the family name forward, who would have helped work the farm, who would have been Charles's partner in the endless struggle to make the land pay. If he had lived, maybe Charles would have stopped moving, would have settled down and focused on making one farm successful, instead of always chasing the next opportunity in the next territory. If he had lived, maybe the family's trajectory would have been different, more stable, less marked by constant movement and repeated failures. But Freddie did not live, and the grief of his loss, the way his tiny body straightened out that August afternoon and went still, the way you had to bury him in an unmarked grave and then leave him behind when the family moved to Iowa, has marked everything that came after. You have carried this pain for 40 years. You will carry it until your own death 14 years from now, and you know that Laura carries it too, though she does not speak of it often, though she has never been able to write about it in the stories she tells about the family's frontier experiences. Laura is quiet after you say this. She knows there is nothing she can say that will ease the pain, no words that will undo the loss, no consolation that will make sense of why a 9-month-old baby had to die because his family was too poor to keep him healthy. She knows that you blame yourself, that you have spent 4 decades wondering if there was something more you could have done, some way you could have saved him. She knows that you also blame the frontier, blame the poverty, blame the grasshoppers and the failed crops and the government policies that made it so difficult for families like yours to survive. And perhaps she knows, though she does not say it, that there is another layer to the blame. That the family's poverty began in Kansas, during those years as illegal squatters on Osage land, when Charles gambled that the government would soon open the territory, and instead federal troops came to remove the white settlers, when the family lost 2 years of potential income and security because Charles chose to squat on indigenous land rather than homesteading legally elsewhere. That the chain of events leading to Freddie's death started with Charles's decision to participate in the illegal occupation of the Osage Diminished Reserve. But this is not something you can say to Laura. This is not something you can even fully articulate to yourself. Because to acknowledge it would be to blame Charles for Freddie's death, to say that your husband's decisions about where to settle and how to pursue opportunity led directly to the poverty that killed your son. And you cannot say that about Charles, the man you loved for 50 years, the man who worked so hard and tried so desperately to provide for his family, the man who carried his own grief about Freddie until he died in 1892. So you say only what you can say. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. And Laura nods, and the conversation moves to other topics, and the full story of Freddie's death and what it meant to your family remains unspoken, buried as deeply as Freddie himself is buried in that lost and unmarked grave in Minnesota. 20 years later, when Laura writes Pioneer Girl, she will include only those 2 sentences about Freddie. Little brother was not well. One awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. She will not elaborate. She will not explore the grief, the guilt, the way his death changed everything for the family. And when she and Rose transform Pioneer Girl into the children's novels, Freddie will be deleted entirely, erased from the published story as if he never existed. But you knew he existed. You held him in your arms during the 9 months and 26 days of his life. You nursed him when your own body did not have enough nourishment to give. You watched him struggle and fail to thrive. You were there when he died. when his little body straightened out one last time and then went still. You buried him. You left him behind. You carried the grief of his loss for 48 years until your own death. And you know the truth that Laura could never write in her books, that the frontier killed your son, that poverty killed him, that the chain of decisions and circumstances that began with illegal squatting on Osage land led ultimately to a 9-month-old baby dying from diarrhea because his family could not keep him healthy. You know that the Little House mythology of pioneer resilience and triumph is built on a foundation of losses that could never be fully acknowledged, of children who died and were erased from the story, of tragedies that did not fit the narrative Americans wanted to hear about their own history. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived, but he did not live, and the story Laura told in her books erased even the fact of his brief existence, creating a version of the Ingalls family that was incomplete, sanitized, mythologized. A version where the frontier was hard but survivable, where poverty built character rather than killing children, where pioneer families triumphed rather than merely surviving at terrible cost. You know the difference between that myth and the reality you lived. You carried that knowledge to your grave, and you hoped that someday someone would tell the full story, would acknowledge all the losses, would recognize that the price of westward expansion was paid not just by the indigenous peoples whose lands were stolen, but also by the white settlers, whose children died from the poverty and deprivation of frontier life. You are sitting in a conference room in Chicago in June of 2018, and you are a member of the Association for Library Service to Children, a division of the American Library Association, and you are about to vote on a proposal that has divided librarians, educators, and Little House fans across the country. The proposal is to rename the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, a prestigious honour given since 1954 to authors and illustrators whose books have made lasting contributions to children's literature. The award has borne Laura Ingalls Wilder's name for 64 years. It has been given to beloved authors like Maurice Sendak and Beverly Cleary and Judy Blume. It represents recognition of literary achievement, a seal of approval that tells readers these authors have created works of enduring value. Laura Ingalls Wilder was the first recipient of the award that would eventually bear her name. Honoured for her Little House series, celebrated as an author who captured American frontier life in books that generations of children have loved. But you are here today because a growing number of librarians, scholars, and indigenous voices have argued that continuing to honour Wilder's name perpetuates the racist ideology embedded in her books. They have pointed to the "No people, only Indians" sentence, to the "only good Indian is a dead Indian" phrase, to the consistent dehumanization of Native Americans throughout the series, to the glorification of settler colonialism and the erasure of indigenous perspectives. They have argued that an award meant to honour excellence in children's literature should not bear the name of an author whose books teach racist attitudes toward indigenous peoples. The debate has been fierce. Defenders of the current name argue that Wilder was a product of her time, that she should not be judged by contemporary standards, that her books have value despite their flaws, that renaming the award erases history rather than confronting it. They argue that millions of people have fond memories of the Little House books, that these stories help them understand American history and pioneer life, that taking Wilder's name off the award feels like an attack on childhood nostalgia and cultural heritage. But supporters of the renaming argue that honouring someone's name is different from preserving historical record. They point out that Wilder's books remain in print and widely available, that no one is suggesting they be destroyed or banned, that removing her name from an award is not erasure, but rather a decision about who deserves contemporary celebration. They argue that Indigenous children deserve to enter libraries and see awards that do not honour authors who dehumanize their ancestors. They argue that institutions have a responsibility to align their values with their actions, and that continuing to prominently display Wilder's name sends a message that racism in children's literature is acceptable, as long as the books are popular and well-written. You have read the Little House books. You remember loving them as a child. You remember identifying with Laura, imagining yourself in that covered wagon heading west, feeling the thrill of adventure and the satisfaction of hard work rewarded. You remember thinking of the Ingalls family as heroes, as examples of American courage and determination. You did not notice the racism when you were young. You did not see the indigenous peoples in the books as fully human. You absorbed the lessons Laura taught about whose perspectives matter and whose can be ignored, and now you are older, more aware, more educated about the realities of westward expansion and indigenous dispossession. You have read scholarship analysing the Little House series from indigenous perspectives. You have listened to Native American librarians describe what it feels like to see Laura Ingalls Wilder's name honoured in libraries, while her books describe their ancestors as savage obstacles to white progress. You have come to understand that the books you loved as a child perpetuated harmful ideologies, that your childhood nostalgia is not more important than the harm those books have caused, and continue to cause. The vote is called. The proposal is to rename the award the Children's Literature Legacy Award, removing Wilder's name while preserving the award's purpose of recognising authors whose books have made lasting contributions to the field. The motion passes unanimously. Every member of the board votes yes, and in that moment you feel both relief and sadness. Relief that the organisation has made the right decision, that it has chosen to prioritise the well-being of Indigenous children over the defence of a problematic author's legacy. Sadness that it took 64 years for this reckoning to happen, that generations of children grew up seeing Wilder's name honoured without understanding the racism embedded in her work. The decision makes headlines. News articles appear in major publications. Social media erupts with passionate arguments on both sides. Some people celebrate the renaming as long overdue recognition of the harm Wilder's books have caused. Others condemn it as political correctness run amok, as the destruction of American cultural heritage, as an attack on beloved childhood memories. Death threats are sent to librarians who supported the change. Indigenous scholars who have critiqued the Little House series receive harassment and abuse from Wilder's defenders. You watch this reaction, and you understand that the renaming has touched a nerve, that it has forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about books they love and the history those books have taught them. The Little House series is not just entertainment, it is mythology. It is how generations of Americans have understood westward expansion, how they have imagined their ancestors' experiences, how they have constructed their national identity. And when you challenge that mythology, when you point out that it is built on racist assumptions and indigenous erasure, people react with anger and defensiveness because you're not just critiquing books, you're challenging their understanding of American history and their own place in it. The official statement from the Association for Library Service to Children explains the decision carefully, respectfully but firmly. Wilder's legacy, as represented by her body of work, includes expressions of stereotypical attitudes inconsistent with ALSC's core values of inclusiveness, integrity and respect, and responsiveness. The statement emphasises that the books remain historically significant, that they continue to be available for readers and scholars, but that honouring Wilder's name sends a message that the organisation wants to avoid. But you know that for many people, this distinction does not matter. They see the renaming as an attack on Wilder herself, as a condemnation of everyone who has ever loved the Little House books, as an attempt to erase an important part of American literary history. They do not understand or do not accept the argument that you can acknowledge a book's historical significance while still recognising its harmful content, that you can study problematic texts without celebrating them, that preserving history is different from honouring the people who created that history. You are reading the responses to the award renaming, the hundreds of articles and blog posts and social media threads debating whether the decision was justified, and you are noticing a pattern in how Wilder's defenders frame their arguments. They keep returning to the idea that she was just recording history accurately, that her books reflect how people actually thought in the 1870s, that criticising her for racism is like criticising a historian for documenting uncomfortable truths about the past. But this defence fundamentally misunderstands what Laura Ingalls Wilder was doing when she wrote the Little House books. She was not a historian recording events as they happened. She was an elderly woman in the 1930s writing fictionalised accounts of her childhood, making deliberate choices about what to include and what to omit, what language to use, whose perspectives to centre, what lessons to teach young readers. The books are not documentary evidence of 1870s attitudes. They are 1930s literature filtered through adult retrospective, shaped by editorial decisions, constructed to serve specific narrative purposes. And even if the books were accurate representations of 1870s attitudes, that would not make them appropriate for contemporary celebration. Historical accuracy is not the same as moral acceptability. The fact that many white settlers in the 1870s believed that the only good Indian is a dead Indian does not mean that contemporary children should read books presenting that genocidal slogan without explicit condemnation. The fact that white families feared indigenous peoples does not mean that books should centre that fear while ignoring the indigenous perspective that white settlers were the actual threat. You find an article by a scholar who makes this point powerfully. Documenting racism is different from perpetuating it. A historian might quote racist statements to show how people thought in a particular era, but that historian would provide context, would explain why those statements are problematic, would present counter-arguments and alternative perspectives. Laura Ingalls Wilder does none of this. She presents racist statements and attitudes without critical distance, without contextualization, without challenging readers to question whether Ma's fear of Indians is justified, or whether Mrs. Scott's genocidal statement is acceptable. She asks readers to identify with white settlers and to share their perspective uncritically. This is not historical documentation. This is ideological instruction. This is teaching children to see the world through the colonizer's eyes, to accept their justifications, to internalize their hierarchies of whose lives matter and whose do not. And the fact that millions of readers have done exactly this, have absorbed these lessons without recognizing them as racist, proves how effective the books are at normalizing colonial violence and indigenous erasure. You find responses from indigenous scholars and writers, and their perspectives cut through the abstract debates about historical accuracy and authorial intent. They write about what it feels like to be a Native American child forced to read Little House on the Prairie in school, to see your ancestors described as savage obstacles, to hear your teacher read the No People, Only Indians sentence without comment, to understand that the books being celebrated as American classics are books that deny your humanity. They write about the lasting harm these books have caused, the way they have shaped how generations of Americans view indigenous peoples, the way they have contributed to ongoing marginalization and discrimination. One indigenous writer describes being 8 years old and reading the Little House books and learning that she was not supposed to exist, that the land her ancestors lived on was supposed to be empty, that white pioneers had every right to take what belonged to her people. Another writes about trying to explain to her daughter why they have to read these books in school, even though the books describe their ancestors in dehumanizing terms, why they have to see Laura Ingalls Wilder's name honored in libraries and celebrated in American culture, even though her books taught millions of children to see indigenous peoples as less than human. These testimonies matter. They reveal the real-world consequences of treating the Little House books as harmless entertainment. They show that the debate about Wilder's legacy is not abstract or theoretical. It is about actual harm experienced by actual people, about indigenous children growing up in a culture that celebrates books denying their humanity, about families having to navigate educational systems that require their children to read texts that perpetuate racist stereotypes about their ancestors and their communities. And you realise that the renaming of the award, while important, is only a small step toward accountability. The books remain on required reading lists in schools across America. They continue to be marketed as wholesome family entertainment. They are still taught without adequate contextualization, without indigenous perspectives, without honest reckoning with the racist ideology they perpetuate. Removing Wilder's name from an award does not address the fundamental problem that her books continue to shape how Americans understand their history, continue to centre white perspectives while marginalising indigenous ones, continue to teach children that colonization was adventure rather than genocide. You read a comment from someone defending the books. I read these books as a child and I didn't become racist, they're just stories. People are too sensitive. And you think about how racism works, how it is not just about individual prejudice, but about systems and structures and narratives that shape what we believe to be normal and natural and right. You think about how the Little House books taught millions of readers, including yourself, to see westward expansion as progress, indigenous peoples as obstacles, white pioneers as heroes. You absorbed those lessons before you were old enough to question them. They became part of how you understood American history, and even now, even after years of education and reflection, you have to consciously work to see past the mythology, to recognize the gaps and silences and erasures, to understand whose perspectives were centered and whose were ignored. The person who says they read the books and did not become racist is probably right in the narrow sense that they do not consciously hate indigenous peoples or support explicit discrimination. But that is not how racism works in the 21st century. Racism works through unconscious biases, through assumptions about whose perspectives matter, through narratives that normalize inequality and erasure. And the Little House books are extraordinarily effective at teaching those lessons, at shaping worldviews in ways that readers do not even recognize, because the ideology is woven so seamlessly into stories that feel comforting and wholesome and true. You're standing in the Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum in DeSmet, South Dakota, in the summer of 2018, just weeks after the award renaming, and you're watching tourists move through the exhibits, families with young children who have read the Little House books and have come here to see the places where Laura lived, to walk through the surveyor's house and the house Pa built, to connect with the stories that shaped their childhood understanding of American history. And you are watching the museum staff navigate an impossible situation. They are here to celebrate Laura Ingalls Wilder, to preserve her legacy, to share her stories with visitors who love the books. But they are also increasingly aware that those stories are incomplete, sanitized, built on erasures and silences that scholars have spent decades documenting. They know that the land they are standing on was taken from indigenous peoples. They know that the Little House books present a romanticized version of frontier life that ignores the violence and dispossession that made white settlement possible. They know that many of the families visiting today have no idea about any of this, that they see the Ingalls family as heroes and the books as accurate history. Some museums have begun to address these issues, adding exhibits about the Osage people whose land the Ingalls family occupied, providing context about westward expansion and indigenous dispossession, acknowledging the problematic aspects of Wilder's depictions. But this is difficult work, made more difficult by visitors who do not want their childhood nostalgia complicated by uncomfortable historical truths, who react with anger when exhibits suggest that their beloved books might be racist, who threaten to stop visiting or donating if the museum continues to politicize Laura's legacy. You overhear a mother reading aloud from a display about the Kansas years, explaining to her daughter that this is where Laura lived when she was little, where the family built their log cabin on the prairie. The little girl asks, "Who lived here before Laura's family?" And the mother pauses, looks around for a sign or exhibit that might answer the question, finds nothing immediately visible and says, "I'm not sure, honey. Maybe nobody lived here. That's why the pioneers came, to settle the empty land." And you realize that this is how the mythology perpetuates itself, how each generation passes it to the next, how the Little House books continue to shape American historical consciousness, even among people who might never reread them as adults. The mother probably read the books herself as a child. She absorbed the lesson that the prairie was empty, that pioneers settled uninhabited land, that westward expansion was about opportunity rather than theft. And now she is passing that lesson to her daughter, not because she is intentionally teaching racism, but because she never learned the fuller, more accurate history herself. You think about what it would take to truly reckon with Laura Ingalls Wilder's legacy. Not just renaming an award or adding a few museum exhibits, but fundamentally changing how we teach these books, how we talk about them, how we understand their place in American culture. It would require acknowledging that books we love can be harmful, that nostalgia is not a sufficient reason to avoid critical examination, that protecting indigenous children from dehumanizing content is more important than preserving white readers' fond memories. It would require teaching the books, if we teach them at all, with extensive contextualization, with indigenous perspectives and voices, with honest discussion of settler colonialism and what it meant for the people whose lands were taken. With acknowledgement that Laura Ingalls Wilder made deliberate choices to centre white experiences and marginalise indigenous ones, that she perpetuated racist ideologies, that her books have caused real harm to Native American readers. It would require being willing to hear indigenous people when they say these books hurt, when they describe the lasting impact of seeing their ancestors dehumanized in texts celebrated as American classics. And it would require confronting the reality that there is much more to Laura Ingalls Wilder's story than what appears in the published books, that she made conscious decisions about what to include and what to hide, what truths to tell and what secrets to bury, that the mythology she created is built on erasures not just of indigenous peoples but of her own family's experiences, of the poverty and loss and moral compromises that the Little House series sanitizes or ignores entirely. You're about to leave the museum when you notice a small exhibit in the corner, one that was not there the last time you visited. It is about Freddie, the baby brother who died and was erased from the published books. The exhibit includes a photograph of his death certificate, a map showing where he was buried, a brief explanation of why Laura chose not to include him in the series. It is a tiny acknowledgement of a massive omission, a small step toward honesty about what Laura left out of her stories, and you realise that this is just the beginning, that Freddie's erasure is only one example of how Laura Ingalls Wilder rewrote her family's history, shaping it into mythology that Americans wanted to believe rather than telling the fuller, messier truth about what frontier life actually cost the people who lived it and the indigenous peoples who were destroyed by it. You walk out of the museum into the bright South Dakota sunlight, and you're thinking about all the other stories Laura never told, all the secrets she buried, all the truths she transformed into comfortable lies. You're thinking about the gap between the Laura Ingalls Wilder that millions of readers believe they know and the real woman who made calculated choices about which version of history to preserve and which to erase. And you're beginning to understand that the racist depictions of indigenous peoples in the Little House books are not the only problem, not the only erasure, not the only way that Laura Ingalls Wilder rewrote history to hide uncomfortable truths. That there is another story waiting to be told, a story about what she left out, what she changed, what she could not bring herself to acknowledge about her own family and their participation in systems of violence and exploitation that destroyed indigenous nations and killed poor white settlers' children with equal indifference. The books you thought you knew are only part of the story. The author you thought you understood was more complicated, more calculating, more aware of what she was doing than the mythology suggests. And the history you learned from those books, the version of westward expansion that has shaped American identity for nearly a century, is built on erasures so systematic and so complete that most readers never notice what is missing. But you are noticing now. You are seeing the gaps, the silences, the careful omissions. You are understanding that Laura Ingalls Wilder did not just write books about her childhood. She rewrote her family's history, erasing everything that did not fit the mythology of noble pioneers overcoming hardship through character and faith. She buried the poverty that killed her brother. She obscured her family's illegal squatting on indigenous land. She transformed her father from a failed farmer and land speculator into a heroic pioneer. She turned her mother's racism and trauma into justified fear. She made colonization look like innocent adventure. And now, finally, decades after her death, more than 80 years after the first Little House book was published, the full story is beginning to emerge. The story of what Laura Ingalls Wilder really wrote, what she deliberately left out, and why the mythology she created has been so powerful, so enduring, and so harmful to the people whose perspectives she erased from American historical consciousness. This is not the end. This is only the beginning of understanding the truth about Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House books. Because there is so much more that she hid, so much more that she rewrote, so many more secrets buried beneath the comforting surface of her pioneer stories. What else did Laura Ingalls Wilder hide from millions of readers? What other truths did she erase from her family's history? What secrets did she take to her grave, hoping they would never be discovered? the answers are more disturbing than you imagine, and the full story of how Laura Ingalls Wilder rewrote history to hide the truth about her family will change everything you thought you knew about the Little House books and the woman who created them. But that story will have to wait for another night.